Welcome to Navigating Net Zero, where we explore the challenges and opportunities of taking climate action in the real world. Each episode, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with leading climate change professionals and experts for honest conversations about what it means to make net zero a reality. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Alexia Kelly, your host here at Navigating Net Zero, the podcast where we discuss what's working, what's not, and what's next on the journey to net zero. I am absolutely delighted to be joined today by the great Richard Lawrence, who I have the privilege of calling my boss. But Richard is also the founder and executive chairman of Overlook Investments Group, which is an independent fund manager that he established in 1991 that invests now $7 billion in Asian public equities and has delivered compound annual returns above 14% over 3 decades, which has just been an extraordinarily successful investing career. Richard grew up outside of New York City and earned his degree in economics from Brown University. After early career roles in South America and New York, he moved to Asia in the mid-1980s, becoming one of the region's first chartered financial analysts before founding Overlook. Alongside his investment career, Richard and his wife Dee Lawrence have co-founded several climate-focused organizations, which we're going to talk a bunch about today, including Proyecto Mirador Foundation, which has built over 4,000 fuel-efficient cookstoves in rural Central America, Cool Effect, a platform vetting and financing high-quality carbon projects, and the High Tide Foundation, where I have the privilege of working, a climate-focused philanthropy, as well as Carbon Mapper, which is a methane observation satellite and data portal. Richard is also the author of The Model, 37 Years Investing in Asian Equities, and most recently, Carbon Done Correctly, a model for climate mitigation from the Global South to Wall Street, which I had the honor of contributing to and which I'm looking forward to speaking to Richard today about. Richard, thank you so much for joining me. It is such a pleasure to have you on the pod.
Well, Alexia, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored. I just would start out by saying that I've long been a fan of Venezuelan baseball, and they won the World Baseball Classic last night. It was a huge victory for a country that really needed a shot in the arm. So that was, I think, something we'd like to honor today as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think looking to sports to help us unify the world and remind us all of our common humanity right now in these times is particularly important. So, Richard, tell me a little bit about the origin story of how you and Dee got into climate action and carbon markets specifically.
Well, we moved from Hong Kong back to San Francisco about 25 years ago, and we had 2 young children, and I was very concerned about living in the bubble of America, the impact that would have on my kids. And so I was looking around to how to make sure that they still knew that the global South existed, which we clearly saw day to day in Asia. And so my daughter and I joined a medical mission and went down to Honduras after a hurricane and basically wiped out the country. And along the way, over 3 or 4 years, eventually my daughter came back into this elementary school where we were running the clinic. And she said, "Dad, I figured out the lung problem." And we had seen over the years a lot of women and children sucking on nebulizers, Alexia. And I looked at her, I kind of twisted my head. It's like, how could this 11-year-old girl solve the health problem? But she said, "Dad, it's the stoves. The stoves are putting just massive amounts of smoke inside these small rural homes." And then we came back 6 months later, and we had found a stove that was being built in part of Honduras, had been invented by some engineers up here in the United States. And we started installing them. The first year we installed 27 stoves. And in the 20 years since then, we've installed 400,000 stoves. And it's a public health initiative at our core. We wanted to get smoke out of the house. But it became very apparent to me, Alexia, in the early days, like, how am I going to build all these stoves? I got no money. And that was when I had the serendipity, really, more than anything else, to find a book written by your friend Ricardo Bayón and my friend Ricardo Bayón called The Voluntary Carbon Market. And I read it over a summer. I came back to San Francisco and I told my assistant, Esther, I said, "Esther, we're going to get gold standard certified and we're going to sell carbon credits." And she looked like I had just jumped off from the moon. But that was an idea that we needed to explore carbon credits because we needed a way to finance the public health initiative.
And I remember when you were first telling me about how you started, you hadn't intended to go into carbon credits, but what ended up happening is you were able to significantly scale your impact through access to climate finance, where you're delivering not just emissions mitigation benefits, but also those public health benefits that you're speaking about. How did that journey reshape your understanding of what carbon finance should do for communities and how it can do it most effectively?
Well, I think the seminal moment came when we began to do all the testing and get the science sorted out to find out how many tons of emissions we reduced. The seminal moment came when I realized that I got to build good stoves.
Hmm.
And our first stove was not a good stove. And we went through a long journey that continues to today to make that stove better and better and better, more reliable, more durable, easier to use for the women. And that incentive change was what I found so powerful, because instead of me being concerned about how many stoves I was installing and building in people's homes, it was like, how do I make these stoves really work? And our early stoves weren't durable. They weren't particularly efficient. And our organization was very basic. Our first two stove builders, guys, Chepe and Santos, from this little town up in the hills, they had no high school education at all. And over a course of the next 3 or 4 years, we went to modernize every aspect, not only of the stove, but of the system that surrounded the stove in terms of really running the organization electronically.
And how long ago did you start the project?
It's close to 20 years now.
Yeah.
We started down in the medical mission 24 years ago. So, yeah, it's close to 20 years.
And so from that first stove and team of two, how many people are you now employing?
We're now at about 350 full and part-time employees. We run the entire organization electronically, so we have hundreds of thousands of survey results. We GPS every stove so we know exactly where the stoves are located. We have about 56 micro enterprises that help us, either in building raw materials or helping supply other technology to us. It's really grown. We started in a small region of coffee growing region in Honduras in the north to now we're spread across Honduras and Guatemala as well.
One of the things that I admire the most about the way in which you and Dee approach this work is really the emphasis on people and finding the right people, empowering the right people, giving those people the resources to just do the right thing and do what they're excellent at doing. So talk a little bit about the first crew, Doña Elena, and the team that really helped us build Mirador into what it is today.
The critical hire was a woman I first met 24 years ago. She was the cook for the medical mission. And there was no sense that Doña Amelia was this extraordinary woman. She was just a cook. But over time, I was one of the few Spanish speakers of the medical mission. And I realized that whenever anybody had a problem, they didn't look for the mayor. They didn't look for the doctor. They went to Doña Amelia. And I thought, And I got to know her. She's a very soft-spoken, endearing woman. But I realized that she was actually the one getting the stuff done. And so after we built our first 27 stoves, we were out at Tela for a day of relaxation with the medical mission. And I sat at a coffee shop with Amelia and I said, Amelia, I need your help. I want you to help me build stoves. And we had very modest ambitions. We didn't know where this was going at all. I certainly couldn't have expected this. And she went out. 2 weeks later, she bought a big Land Cruiser, and Doña Amelia drove around delivering the raw materials and Chepe and Santos to these communities where we'd tell the ladies what they needed to do and the homeowners what they needed to do. And then Chepe and Santos would build the stoves, and Amelia would go on to the next community to sell the idea of putting in fuel-efficient stoves. And from Amelia came Professor Elder and a whole host of other people. And today, 20 some years on, Proyecto Mirador is largely being run by her third child, ingeniero Rafael Mendoza, who's a wonderful executive. And so we've built this crew of people who their life work is helping the poorest of the poor. And they do it with modern technology, modern skill sets. We have a lab that we've created in Honduras where we're testing new improvements to our stoves. You wouldn't recognize it that we're just building stoves, you know.
You're not just building stoves, right?
And
You're
I
building a
tell
whole
you,
new industry.
I tell you, Alexia, when we first went down, we brought down with a IT guy, Steven Simic from Colorado, we brought down some Macs and some iPhones. And the Hondurans had never held a Mac or an iPhone. And we said to them, this is how we're going to run the business. And they must have looked at us like we were from outer space as well.
When we were in, MD and I were just in Kenya, we were out looking at one of the projects, and I remember the team telling us about what it took to sell the project to the community. And they said it took them like 2 years to convince the communities that these crazy people from the global north wanted to buy the air. They just like couldn't wrap their head around it. They were like, what? Are you kidding me? Like, we're going to sell them air? And I just think it's such an amazing kind of beautiful part of the market that, it's like the least extractive way to do international development work, in my opinion, if it's done right. And, we get just all this guff for it, but it always makes me laugh because really, truly, like when you do it right, it just becomes part of the lifeblood of these communities. And you built an entirely new economy around improving women's health, all people's health, and addressing climate change.
Really from day one, Proyecto Mirador has not spent 1 cent on promotion. It's all been the power of mouth to mouth, person to person. And we build in one community and the next door community. And then we find out that that person has an aunt over on the other side of Honduras and she wants the stoves. And it went viral in Honduras and now it's gone viral in Guatemala. In the old days, we used to have a big stack of papers where people literally would travel across Honduras to deliver a list of names and communities where they wanted our stoves. We've modernized that a little bit now, and we do it. The Hondurans have caught up and we do it electronically. But to me, it's been the greatest testimony as we struggled to build a better stove and a stronger stove and a more durable stove. The Honduran women never gave up on us, never gave up on us.
Love that. Let's talk about that continuous improvement because I think it's really important and it's a thing that the market is grappling with today. And I actually think that nowhere is that evolution more evident than in the cook stove sector, right? As the science, as the understanding, as the kind of norms around what acceptable looks like from a crediting levels perspective, we've seen these huge peaks and valleys, and the market, I think the focus on relentless improvement has been great. It has also been extremely difficult to navigate. I know, for the folks implementing action on the ground. So talk a little bit about how you see that journey in perspective and how we make this ride, I think, a little less bumpy as we move into this next stage of the market.
I think it's really critical to build into the culture of the organization this idea that we continually improve, that we are innovating, and in all aspects on the electronic stuff, on how we interview, how we train people, how we build our stoves. I think that's important. They all come for training purposes to Santa Barbara or Chiquimula for training. But one of the things we've done is in our upstairs of our office, right around the outside wall of the office, we showed all the improvements that we made. Okay. And so it helps to develop this culture. And now with 350 people, you got to work at selling that culture. And this is part of the reason why in a couple of weeks, my wife and I are going down to Guatemala to celebrate the construction of 400,000 stoves, because I love it, because it's giving me an opportunity to, say to them the importance of all their individual ideas. Don't sit on them. Let us hear about them, about every aspect. You never know what the key is going to be. And I'll tell you, we had a problem early on that was really going to kill us because we couldn't get the level of the ash and below the griddle is important for efficiency's sake. and we couldn't get it right. And my partner, Professor Elder, invented a little piece of $1 metal that works as a windshield wiper that keeps the ash exactly at the right level. And that $1 piece of equipment changed our lives, changed fundamentally the success. So you don't know where the next innovation's coming from.
Yeah. And so often I feel like those innovations and insights come from the users of the equipment and the implementers on the ground who are doing this work. And I love that you've built that cycle of continuous improvement and feedback into both the way in which you just do business and I would say in other initiatives that we've been involved in, like the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, like that continuous improvement has been a fundamental part of what we're doing. But from a regulatory perspective, it's been a rough go for cookstoves the last couple of years. Tell me a little bit about the evolution from Proyecto Mirador to Cool Effect and eventually to the High Tide Foundation and the philanthropic work that you all have been doing.
During our travels, Alexia, with the cookstoves, we began to go to a few conferences where they were talking about stove technology, and we ran into other people that were building stoves in other parts of the world. And they were having the same financial challenge that I had faced. And we then began to, through our network, began to see other project developers doing other things, saving forests, planting trees and whatnot. And the commonality was all of us were facing, financial challenges. And so we kind of decided, actually, my wife and I were at home one night over a glass of wine, and we said, well, if we could really help Proyecto Mirador with carbon credits, why can't we bring that same carbon credit expertise to other projects around the world? And so we began then, we hired a guy, Sid Yadav, who had been an auditor, a carbon credit project auditor, to help us find the very great projects. And there was really a parallel in the early days of Cool Effect, even today, with my investment management business, which is that we have a portfolio of 22 names, 20 to 22 stocks across Asia. And we try to find the absolute best companies we can at reasonable valuations. And it was the same challenge. How do we sort through hundreds of project developers to find the very best? The people who really believed in transparency, believed in being fair, believed in the science. And Sid was really instrumental in helping us identify those projects. And then over time, after some failings on the Cool Effect side, we began to find some corporate buyers who were really aligned with our vision of supporting the very best carbon projects around the world.
So in your wonderful book, Carbon Done Correctly, which I have read with great attention, and it's a really wonderful read. It tells the whole story in great detail of Proyecto Mirador and how you got there. But you talk about this top of the pyramid approach. And I think that's really fundamental to both the way in which you've addressed and approached the Proyecto Mirador process, but then also Cool Effect and sort of everything else you do in business. So talk about a little more about, what defines a top of the pyramid project developer and investment opportunity, because the parallels are really interesting.
Yeah, I see pyramids on almost everything I study, whether it's stocks, and at the top of the pyramid are the really great companies. At the bottom of the pyramid are what we call value traps in the investment world, right? And it was the same with the carbon projects. We saw a lot of guys that were gaming numbers and weren't up to the challenge, and they were overly promotive, and a lot of the business practices that we saw we didn't like, and those were at the bottom of the pyramid guys. At the top of the pyramid guys were the people really, at some level, struggling as we had struggled to get it right, but were really doing it in an ethical manner with the very best intentions. And so, and it goes beyond that, Alexia, if you look at methodologies. Mm-hmm. They're methodologies that were good and fundamentally aimed in the right direction. They needed modernization, but they were fundamentally okay. And there were others that, in our view, weren't okay. I can go on for an hour here talking about other analogies of pyramids. But the short answer is you want to get up as high as you can in the pyramid and stay there for as long as you can. And if you do that, you're going to be fine. You're going to be doing well above average work. You're going to be bringing well above average companies to your corporate buyers.
But I think the interesting implication of the top of the pyramid and that focus is that it then pulls up everything below. So the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets, which I know you and Dee were heavily involved in early on, I think also has that same theory, which is really define what right looks like, and the scale is going to follow. But that's not always intuitive, right? And it's not always been the way in which the market has evolved, I think. So tell us a little bit about the TSVCM process and the Integrity Council and how that journey has helped shape kind of where the market is today.
When Mark Carney, who's now Prime Minister of Canada, called us up and said he wanted some funding for a task force that was going to modernize the voluntary carbon market, we were the first ones to put our hand up. We saw bad practices. We knew transparency, science, rigor, commitment, was all part of the solution. And we needed to upgrade the systems. We needed to upgrade every aspect of the system. We needed to upgrade the developers. We needed to upgrade the methodologies. We needed to upgrade the standards. We needed to upgrade the buyers, And so when Mark reached out, it was really a good day because Dee and I on our own hadn't figured out that this was what was needed. But once we were told that's what was needed, we realized, yes, that's needed.
But then you had the foresight, I think, to really help write that first check, get that team in place, get the process kicked off. And I think now here we are, oh my gosh, 6 years on, almost 5.5 years on. What a difference it's made. I think I saw a thing today that said that CCP credits have increased 100% in the last year and that we're seeing significant pricing premiums associated with the core carbon principles label.
Yeah. And what we did is we just grew collectively all aspects. We grew the top of the pyramid.
Yeah.
And that was what was needed. And they're all going to be naysayers. And they're going to be people who believe that tearing down is better than building up. I'm of the view that we all have responsibilities to build up, particularly in the global south. And so we're making carbon credits relevant again. The CCPs from the ICVCM are a big chunk of this. But there's a lot of other work going on. TCAT, which you mentioned, VCM Plus, which I know you've been working really hard on. You, Alexia, are the VCM's ever-ready bunny, right? And just nonstop drive to make everybody better. And both sides need it, from the developers to the buyers. We all need it, and it's coming. And we will not be free of criticism of journalists and ivory tower academics that want a headline, but we are now building a base of real expertise. We have flushed the toilet on a lot of bad actors, on a lot of bad methodologies, and we're moving in the right direction. It's very akin to early days in a bull market, in the financial market, where skepticism stays really high, and yet stocks are going up because some people have seen through the skepticism and are now on board. And that's kind of where we are. And good things happen from here.
And I think it's a real testament to the market that despite all of the noise, it's continuing to grow. And, I think you and I personally certainly stay in this fight because I feel like we have an obligation to be a voice for the people who do not have a voice in many of the rooms and conversations that we participate in and have access to. I think that's a really important part of what you have done through the empowerment of the full team with Proyecto Mirador and the work you do platforming and highlighting and really pointing to the best of the best in terms of the project development community. And then, of course, through your broader philanthropic work, really supporting and building that ecosystem of transparency, accountability, integrity through the work we do at the Carbon Policy and Markets Initiative and more broadly. So talk a little bit about High Tide, the birth of High Tide, and how you see it really helping shape this full set of issues we're covering.
Well, I think High Tide, let me say, with philanthropy, okay, it is the highest risk money that a capitalist system has because it's money that people really don't need to feed their babies or buy their car or pay their house bill. This is completely excess money. And that money should be managed with an acknowledgement that it's high risk. It can take high rewards. It can move quickly. Okay. And it was that basis on which my wife and I set up High Tide. We wanted to move fast. We wanted to take risks. Okay. And we went through a process where we supported a lot of efforts, and we've narrowed that down over the last 10 or 11 years, where we want to play a bigger role in areas where we think we have expertise and the people, and we want to move fast, and we want to take risk. And if you build that in to the philanthropy, you're going to make some mistakes, but you'll have a much bigger impact long term by doing it that way. And the challenge is, as we need to fix, and we have fixed the VCM, we need, to a certain extent, to fix philanthropy. Philanthropy has to move faster. It cannot, the ultra wealthy, I read it this week from Bridgespan, the ultra wealthy give away 1.2% of their money. Now, a large endowment like Stanford University would give away 4.5% to 5%, and their assets would still grow. There is no justification for a 1.2% payout ratio. Absolutely zero. And so we need to also work to fixing philanthropy. Now, within that challenge, my wife and I can really only touch on climate change philanthropy because 95% of our giving is aimed at climate change. And so I can't make the people doing inner city art move faster. They just don't want to listen to me, and they don't want to hear from me. But within the climate community, we need to move faster, particularly what we call the ultra wealthy.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? I mean, just to be a little provocative, what do you think a reasonable payout rate would look like for
minimum 4.5, but more like 7 or 8?
Yeah, it's not even going to make a dent.
I mean,
right? In the
4.5. If Richard Lawrence said 4.5%, High Tide would live into eternity.
Yeah.
Okay. High Tide does not need to live into eternity. But when you give away 1.2%, to fix the problem in 10 years is going to be multiple times bigger. And generally, at that point, the original entrepreneur will have passed away or gotten old. So second generation resistance to really taking action.
And I understand that in the philanthropic space, really only about 2% of total giving goes to climate. So talk a little bit about some of the work you're doing to accelerate and expand climate philanthropy more broadly. I know you've been supporting efforts like Climate Lead and others.
When we started 10 years ago, there were about 10 philanthropists that were really significant, call it, in climate. Today, they're about 55, and it's growing. It needs to grow. I think the political backdrop of the last 14 months has slowed our progress. But the problem, as you know, Alexia, is not going away. We can deny it, but it's not going away.
Yeah.
And so one of our efforts at High Tide is to be engaged, and we have events, we have training sessions, we have one-on-one sessions with new philanthropists to help them get up to speed on climate. We also have gatherings where we do two things. We educate each other where we all are on the spectrum of climate change, and we also work on several initiatives that are collaborative in nature, such as we were one of the leaders in setting up the Global Methane Hub, which you get these big initiatives that scale if we all get focused on it at various times. And so we're headed in the right direction. It's just really hard. Philanthropists prefer to put their names on buildings than deal with the really tough sledding of climate change.
Yeah, though I will say I've been definitely encouraged, at least in our space in the carbon markets. I feel like there's an increasing, still tiny, but increasing number of philanthropic organizations that really understand the importance and role of market fundamentals in helping build the next generation of environmental commodity markets broadly. You talk about in the book, and you've talked a lot before about this idea of moving the market into a more kind of formally regulated, something that looks more like it's run by financially chartered analysts as opposed to, what it is now, which is really people who have often learned by doing and working in implementation. Tell us a little bit about how we help mature this market and how we really move it into its next iteration.
Well, yeah, I think go back 10 years, and go back 10 years, the buyers at these major companies that wanted to offset their emissions for their own reasons, they'd never dealt with brokers or markets or pricing. They didn't know. And likewise, the guys making stoves or planting trees, they didn't know anything about finance. Now, what we've done through all our efforts is we're bringing those two groups together. We're filling in the gaps. They're now very sophisticated people who understand that in order to make this a well-functioning market, all the pieces that are required, your TCAT, VCM Plus, rating agencies, better standards, digital systems, DMRV, all of those gaps are being filled, and which will lead us in the next several years to hopefully giving all people on all sides the trust that they need to transact at higher volumes.
It's interesting too, because as I'm thinking about kind of through lines of your work just across all of the different places that transparency leads to trust and trust leads to scale moniker, I think has shown up in lots of different ways, right? It's shown up in the transparency and credibility with which you've run Proyecto Mirador. It's shown up in the pricing pledge and the seller's pledge at Cool Effect, which actually would be great to have you talk about for a minute. But it's also shown up in the work you've done with Carbon Mapper and just increasing and sea trees and the remote sensing technologies that you've invested so heavily in. That, that transparency really is the foundation of any market. And I spend a lot of time talking with other people in my field who say, well, transparency is not enough. And my answer to that is always, it's not enough by itself, but it is the foundation.
Yes.
It is the thing that enables accountability. It is the thing that enables direction of capital. It is the thing that enables kind of everything we need in order to make this market a fully fledged functioning part of the mainstream financial market and infrastructure. So how does that through line kind of play out for you? And how do you see the role of transparency in the work that you do to promote it as core to this market?
Well, I think transparency has to go at every level, at every step, from the developer right to the buyer, okay? Transparency to everything. I mean, one of the things that was just driving me nuts 6 years ago was, these brokers, these middlemen were taking advantage of the lack of transparency to take these unbelievable markups on stuff, on credits. And so we adopted what you mentioned, the seller's pledge, which we guarantee legally. The idea of the seller's pledge was to make transparency legal. Now, I've had a lot of people tell me that they're honest. And my general rule is the more someone tells me they're honest, the less honest they are. Okay? And so rather than me sitting here telling you, Alexia Kelly, I am honest, I'd say, I don't need to tell you that because we put it in our legal documents. We legally guarantee that the buyer and the seller knows what each one got. And I've been pushing the idea of the seller's pledge with not a great deal of success, as you might imagine, because policies still exist about lack of transparency at brokers. But we need that transparency at every step along the way. We're not going to achieve it unless we get really right from A to Z bought in on this.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the market will get there. I actually think the next couple of years are the years when that's really going to come to the fore. And a lot of, I think, the conversation we need to have in the next couple of years and that we're really looking to foster through the Verified Carbon Market Coalition is specifically on this transition. Like, how do we help the market move from the highly fragmented, kind of balkanized governance system that we've been operating under the last 20 years for good reason, right? Like all of these nonprofit organizations stepped into a breach of governance with good faith and I think very good intentions. And through no fault of their own, all had to come up with a different set of solutions to this fundamental question of what information needs to be disclosed by whom and when. Under what conditions is that information being disclosed? Where is it being disclosed? There's actually a lot to building really good transparency infrastructure that works and that informs the market without disadvantaging people, because I think that's also another really important part of this conversation.
There's a counter to blind transparency, okay, which is over the last 15 years, the demands on Proyecto Mirador down in Honduras have gone straight up. We went from 43 pages now to hundreds of pages for our annual verification. It's gone completely over the top, and there is no consistency at the standards of a person doing last year's verification for us and doing this year's verification for us. So we got endless back and forth. And so you need to temper the demands for transparency with really focusing in on the pieces that are absolutely essential.
That's right.
for the brokers, the middlemen. What did they pay the developers and what did they sell them for? There has to be transparency there, or there have to be limits on it. Otherwise, you lose your trust. It's a balancing act, and we just need to be careful we don't go too far.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I think it's interesting as we sort of have this conversation about how do we make this market look more like traditional financial markets, right? Like brokers who are trading stocks and bonds aren't necessarily disclosing their spread, right? So how do you think about that as the market matures? Do you think we should have a higher level of transparency and disclosure on market intermediation in the carbon market than we do other markets?
Well, I always tell the story, and this dates me, and probably less true today, but in the early 80s, when I got into the stock market and the financial business, there was a ticker, and there still probably is a ticker, but it's electronic, of all transactions, buying and selling. And so the buyers and sellers can see when they put an order in what it's selling for. In the bond market, there isn't that transparency. And guess what Goldman Sachs likes to trade? They like to trade bonds because there isn't transparency. So the spreads on carbon credits are way higher than what Goldman Sachs gets on bonds. So we need to bring them down. We need to bring transparency. We need to have people like Cool Effect that are legally committed to transparency on pricing. And we need better educated buyers that understand that there are now multiple places where they can get credits and they can compare pricing.
So tell me, Richard, if we get all of this right, if we're able to get this pricing infrastructure in place, we're able to really, the ICVCM continues to be successful in setting that threshold benchmark. What do you think the implications are for the global economy and our fight against climate change?
Well, it's giving us a tool in our toolbox. It's not the solution. Look, let's be serious. This is not the solution, right? But it is a tool in our toolbox, and it's generally aligned with the capitalist system. Okay, so the capitalists can't say, no, we're not going to do this. Here's a market-based solution, driving aid down to the global south for the most part. Not all of it, but most of it goes down to the global south at a time when people are pulling back from that. People are having, no success. Government aid hasn't really been successful. And so here's a market-based solution. I think it's enormously valuable. How big we're going to get, you're never going to get me to quote a number, Alexia, because I've seen a lot of numbers quoted in the past, and you can't do that. But if we create, Alexia, with all your work and all the support you've gotten from your collaborators and your partners to really get this thing to fully function, it'll be a very important day.
I would argue also that it is the solution for communities like the communities that you're serving in Honduras, right? Nobody else was coming. And the fact that you have invested, 20 years of your time and money and passion, frankly, in helping deliver these solutions to frontline communities is incredibly commendable. And I think rare, right? You saw a problem and you said, we're going to solve this problem. And I think that imbues everything that you and Dee do in your work, and that perspective ripples out and makes what seem like intractable problems feel tractable.
Well, Alexia, when I'm in Guatemala next week and we get, I don't know how many of our employees in a ballroom, I'm going to tell them what I tell them on every trip, which is Honduras and Guatemala have given more to me than I have given to them. And that is a clear message that everybody needs to get, that the solutions that we're promoting are really helping people where there is no other help. The government of Honduras is not a functioning government. If you're living in rural Honduras, you just don't see it.
That really is the magic of these markets. And this is why I've dedicated so much of my career to working on them, because I've never seen any kind of international aid program that more effectively delivers exactly what a community needs on terms and conditions the community has set at the right time in the right place. Like, it just doesn't happen. And so when these markets are correctly designed and are correctly deployed, they have just life-changing benefit and impact for the communities that we are collectively here to serve.
I'll tell you a story, Alexia, about doing it right, which was for about 5 years, the president of Honduras tried to set up a competing stove operation. I think he thought it was going to be a good election gimmick. And he built a lousy stove, no follow-up, no training, no nothing. The stoves were always just abandoned. And he did a really bad job And it didn't help his election because he had to then steal the election by jigging the numbers, which gave him another 4 years. But after 4 years was up, he got his due, which was the Hondurans delivered him to the American military. And the American military took him to New York, put him in Rikers Island, where a court in America convicted him for 40 years for transporting 300 tons of cocaine. And so he got his due. Whether that was because he tried to compete with Richard Lawrence, I don't know.
Only the gods will know.
But only the gods will know. But as a sign of our times, the current president released this man and gave him a full pardon.
Well, so, Richard, you're a, as you like to say, perfectly wealthy guy. You could be sitting on the beach, sipping Mai Tais and, enjoying a leisurely retirement. Why have you indeed dedicated your lives to this work?
Let's not get too hyperbolic about all of this. I mean, look, we all are put on earth. We are all stewards. This is not my money. I am a steward, as Chris Hahn likes to say. We are all stewards. And so we have responsibilities. And so we do it. I love what we've done in Honduras. I love what we've done at Cool Effect. I like what we're doing on methane. And to have an opportunity to have a big impact is really a wonderful opportunity. And this is what other philanthropists really need to realize, that when you really solve a big problem, that's a damn good thing. And it doesn't have to be about fame or fortune or anything else.
Well, and I think it's funny because I think often people don't realize that High Tide is among, the largest climate philanthropies in the world, precisely because you guys aren't in it for the fame and fortune. We're all, I think, here in that spirit of solving the big problems and getting the work done and delivering those outcomes and impact, because it's not about us. It's about everybody else and the impact that we are hopefully engendering. So while I have you, I just, as always, want to thank you and Dee so much for all of the incredible contributions you've made to this space and for making this podcast happen and enabling me to focus on the things that are, in my opinion, most important, which is really fixing this market and getting carbon pricing right. And first and foremost, directing massive amounts of additional new money into mitigating the climate crisis. That's what we're here to do.
Alexia, before you came to work for us, you could have gone and worked for lots of different people. And you came and decided to come work for us. And Dee and I went home that day and said, wow, that was surprising. And you are truly the ever-ready bunny of the voluntary carbon market. You are engaged with the ICBC.
Verified carbon market.
Verified carbon market, $20.
So you're going to owe me.
On a podcast, no less.
Yeah.
And the verified carbon market is going to owe you a huge debt of gratitude because you're involved with VCM Plus and TCAT and the ICBCM and so many of these efforts that are filling the gaps and weaving this market-based solution together. So I couldn't be more proud of the work you've done, Alexia, and very thankful because at times Dee and I get credit for things that we did not do.
Well, but you enabled them to happen. And that actually is where all the credit goes, because none of us would be here were it not for you two. So thank you so much for joining me. It's been wonderful to chat with you today, and keep up the good fight. Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you as well.
That's it for this episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to follow or subscribe, and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues. Thank you for listening. Until next time, be well and keep up the great work.